Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 91, Stealing the Horse. Mid-March is a good time to start spring plowing. In Denmark, spring plowing has just begun because of the high latitude. However, due to the war, spring plowing has been suspended in many places in the Duchy of Holstein and the Duchy of Schleswig. In this regard, neither Marin, Lübeck or Hamburg want to see it. Therefore, after taking over the city of Ribe, Marin temporarily stationed with the army. At the same time, Marin sent people to the estuary of the Ribe River near the city of Ribe to build several long bridge piers for communication with the mainland. The main purpose is to let the mainland provide the materials needed for the war. After the army was stationed, Marin recruited a group of locals and ordered them to go to various parts of the Duchy of Schleswig to notify those manors to resume spring plowing immediately. The army promised not to interfere with them during the spring plowing period. The representatives of the two Hanseatic cities of Weizmann and Hermann also responded quickly and sent a group of people back to the Duchy of Holstein. According to the principle of East-West division, they urged the locals to continue spring plowing in the east and west of the Duchy of Holstein. Because Marin used strict military discipline to restrain his soldiers, the two duchies suffered little damage despite the army's crossing. Only the manors of some stubborn barons or knights were attacked, and some young men who participated in the resistance were killed. However, most serfs did not participate in the resistance because of cowardice, and naturally did not suffer any losses. At this time, it was okay to let them continue spring plowing. In the era of war and chaos, a large number of civilians died, not in the massacre. Instead, when the army passed through, it was easy to let the soldiers rob food. Even some chaotic soldiers would rob the seeds left by farmers for sowing. All the rations and seeds were robbed, and the farmers had no choice but to starve to death or rebel. Marin deeply understood that whether it was the Duchy of Schleswig or the Duchy of Holstein, it would be his and his allies' territory in the future. If you want to prevent these two places from being in chaos, you must not rob the people's food. In addition, it is necessary to ensure the normal progress of spring plowing and autumn harvest. Therefore, after taking over the city of Ribe, Marin hired local people to ride horses to various manors to promote policies to encourage spring plowing, and posted notices stating that his army would not rob. Even when he captured several cities before, those rewards were all paid by Marin himself. Of course, the money was also looted from the official silver vault of the city. Marin knew that if nothing unexpected happened, Ribe would become the border area between the Duchy of Schleswig and Denmark that he occupied in the future. Therefore, this must be a frontline city. For this reason, Marin began to mobilize the city residents here, as well as his soldiers and civilians, to repair the city of Ribe, preparing to use it as a fortress for a long time. For the nobles who surrendered voluntarily in the city, Marin gave very generous treatment, but temporarily deprived them of their military power to prevent them from repeating. Today, the number of nobles of the Duchy of Schleswig who surrendered to Marin has reached thousands. These people are also a burden in Marin's hands. Marin needs to guard against them at all times, so he needs a lot of manpower. Moreover, if they were allowed to return to their own territories, it would be like letting the tigers go back to the mountains. God knows whether these people will rebel one day. So, Marin remembered a gambling city plan that he thought of when he conquered the earldom of Oldenburg. That is to build a gambling city and entertainment city similar to Las Vegas, specifically for these surrendered nobles and their descendants to eat, drink and have fun. As for their territories, Marin plans to send people to take over. Then, return the benefits they could receive before to them. As for the excess part caused by the use of new fertilizers to achieve high yields, it naturally belongs to Marin. In addition, the territories of those small nobles who were killed because of their stubborn resistance were naturally confiscated by Marin. Then, take out a part of it to reward brave soldiers. The Duchy of Schleswig, which occupied 9,200 square kilometers at once, gave Marin nearly 3 times the land area of his native land. Therefore, Marin now has enough land to reward soldiers. At that time, as long as a few more fertilizer fields are built in the Duchy of Schleswig, the grain production of local manors can be properly increased. However, after Marin led his army into the Duchy of Schleswig, he discovered a problem, that is, the Jutland Peninsula is vast and sparsely populated. Yes, according to local nobles, the entire Danish mainland, including the Jutland Peninsula and several islands such as Zealand, 42,000 square kilometers, including the Danes in North Schleswig, has only 600,000 people at this time. The Kingdom of Norway has a population of 240,000, Sweden has 550,000, Finland has 300,000. In other words, the total population of Sweden and Finland is 850,000. The total population of Denmark and Norway is only 840,000, which is less than the area controlled by Old Sten Sture. Therefore, the Swedes have the confidence to resist. There are only 600,000 Danes on nearly 40,000 square kilometers of land. Moreover, the majority of the population must be in the core area of Denmark, Zealand. Therefore, the Jutland Peninsula, including more than 3,900 square kilometers of North Schleswig, has a population of only 200,000 on a land area of 25,400 square kilometers. You know, the population of a county where Marin lived in later generations exceeded 800,000, and the area was only more than 1,000 square kilometers. So, at this time, the Jutland Peninsula was still sparsely populated. In order to make use of the land, many locals were engaged in animal husbandry, cattle and sheep farming were relatively developed, and many people raised horses. Only about half of the population was engaged in rye and oat planting, and most of them were cultivated on fertile soil by the river. After learning this information from the surrendered Danish nobles, Marin coveted the vast Jutland Peninsula. However, he also knew that Denmark was not something he could eat at the moment. This time, he finally found an excuse to attack Denmark, and it was already too much to cut off the Duchy of Schleswig. If you want to cut off the Jutland Peninsula, which is much larger than the Duchy of Schleswig, let alone Denmark's refusal, others will also oppose it. In the case that his own strength was not enough to challenge all of Germany, Marin could only temporarily endure and suppress his ambition to annex Denmark. However, since he had already made enemies with Denmark, Marin had no reason to let the other party have an easy time. Right now, it was the time when the Danish region began spring plowing. Marin allowed the Principality of Schleswig to plow smoothly in the spring, but he might not be willing for the Danes to plow smoothly in the spring. In addition, Marin needed a lot of horses, and the horses in the Danish region were relatively tall. For this reason, Marin planned to send cavalry across the northern border of the Principality of Schleswig, go deep into the Jutland Peninsula, and rob horses everywhere. The reason for robbing horses was not only to increase the number of horses for himself, but also to strike at Danish agriculture. The Danes, like other parts of Europe, were popular with horse plowing at this time. Therefore, draft horses were the most important animal power for Danish farmers. As for cattle, the Danes obviously did not understand what a bull-nose ring was, and naturally could not easily drive cattle to work. Therefore, the ones plowing in the fields now were basically tall Nordic draft horses. Marin couldn't bear to kill people, but if he didn't kill people, he would still destroy Danish agriculture. So, robbing the Danes' draft horses became the best choice. Moreover, the cavalry had strong mobility. After robbing the draft horses, the cavalry only needed to put on the reins, ride the horses while leading the robbed draft horses, and then they could whistle away, which was very convenient. According to the surrendered nobles, there were about 100,000 serfs on the Jutland Peninsula, and there were about tens of thousands of draft horses. Not only that, several important horse farms on the Jutland Peninsula were also an important source of war horses for the Danish King Han's army. Hearing this, Marin immediately became excited. So, according to the instructions of the surrendered nobles, he planned to send all the cavalry to seize the horse farms belonging to the royal family first and rob the thousands of horses in them. Then, he would rob the draft horses used by the serfs to cultivate the land. In this way, the grain production in Jutland, Denmark will inevitably drop significantly this year. At that time, even if Marin and his men withdrew their troops, the serfs would cause trouble for the Danish King Hans because of hunger. The 1,000 lancers recruited from the Teutonic state, after hearing that there were several royal horse farms set up by the Danish King Hans on the Jutland Peninsula, began to get excited without Marin's encouragement. After all, that was the Danish king's horse farm, not the draft horses used by those serfs. There must be a lot of good horses suitable for war horses. For these cavalrymen, they are all horse lovers. So how could they miss it? Moreover, Marin also promised them that he would allow them to choose good horses from them to replace the horses they originally rode. So, after getting the specific location from Marin, 1,000 lancers roared and headed for the Danish royal horse farms. In addition, Marin also selected more than 1,000 infantrymen with good riding skills, and asked them to ride on the draft horses pulling the carts and go to the manor halfway in Jutland to rob the draft horses. Marin believed that after this horse-robbing operation, the spring plowing of the Danes on the Jutland Peninsula would be greatly affected. By the autumn, famine on the Jutland Peninsula is almost certain. By then, King Hans of Denmark will definitely be in a state of panic. And this is exactly what Marin wants to see. Otherwise, if he is idle, King Hans of Denmark will be ready to retaliate against himself. However, Marin felt sad when he thought that many innocent Danish civilians would starve to death after the autumn. But he quickly threw these thoughts out of his mind. If you want to participate in the game of hegemony, you can't have the slightest woman's kindness. All saint bitches, even if they travel through time, are only suitable to be a peaceful idler. Such people, if they participate in the game of hegemony, will definitely die ugly. Marin didn't want to die, so he had to harden his heart and do many cruel and vicious things. Emperors like Emperor Wu of Liang, who believed in Buddhism and had a woman's kindness, deserved to be killed and become stepping stones for others. Even a hero like Xiang Yu, because of his temporary woman's kindness, was eventually overturned by the shameless Liu Bang and committed suicide by the Wujiang River, becoming Liu Bang's stepping stone. Chapter 92 The Danish Countermeasures. Inside the royal palace in Copenhagen, Denmark, there was a gloomy atmosphere. At this time, the Kingdom of Denmark had reached a moment of life and death. My dear ministers, what can we do? The Kalmar Union is in danger. What advice do you have for me? The once arrogant Danish King Hans was now in a state of panic and at a loss. Humph, Thomason, it's all your fault. You persuaded His Majesty to provoke the county of East Frisia. Now, their revenge is coming. Minister of the Army Simonson and Minister of the Navy Thomason have never been on good terms. So, as soon as he opened his mouth, Simonson put the blame on Thomason. How could Thomason be happy? At the beginning, wasn't it a unanimous decision to send a fleet to scare East Frisia and blackmail it? If your army wasn't so bad, would we have lost the Duchy of Holstein and the Duchy of Schleswig? Thomason couldn't help but retort. The army is too bad. My army was all deployed to the Swedish battlefield. How could I know that Marin, the little thief, would join Lübeck and Hamburg to attack us? I wanted to withdraw the main force, but now the Swedes are sticking to us like glue and won't let us withdraw. Seeing that the two ministers were about to quarrel, King Hans immediately came out to save the situation. Don't quarrel, my two beloved ministers, let's think of a solution. Our army is now tied up, and our navy is less than half of its strength. What do you think we should do now? Your Majesty, I think the enemy's next step will definitely be to unite the warships of the three families to destroy our remaining 80 warships. Therefore, I think we should withdraw the remaining 80 warships into the Copenhagen Bay and let the army's artillery and projectile vehicles protect them together. Navy Minister Thomason thought for a while and said. Denmark now has only 80 warships left, while the enemy's warships add up to more than 200. If they fight hard, they will definitely not be the opponent. It is better to hide in the Copenhagen Bay and protect them. If these 80 warships were also destroyed, Denmark would immediately become a weak maritime country. Moreover, Copenhagen Bay is very peculiar. It is a long bay, like a wide canal, cutting off Zealand Island. The warships retreated into Copenhagen Bay, just like hiding in the canal. Then, the catapults and a small number of artillery on both sides can be fully utilized to protect the warships in the bay. What about the land? I can't just watch the enemy occupy all my territory, right? King Hans said worriedly. Your Majesty, I also want to resist the enemy. However, the enemy has a full 30,000 troops. Even if all the infantry on the Swedish battlefield are withdrawn, there are only 15,000 people. Face to face, they are not the opponent. That Marin, but he defeated the 26,000 troops of the Duchy of Saxony with 10,000 troops. What's more, now the Swedes are holding us back. Simonson looked depressed. Is there no other way? King Hans asked with a frustrated face. If he were given a chance to do it again, he would never choose to offend Marin, the evil star. For the benefit of 100,000 gold coins, Denmark was in danger. Your Majesty, I have some ideas. Foreign Minister Eriksson stood up. Speak quickly, my dear minister. King Hans is now at the end of his rope, and he doesn't want to let go of any possibility. Your Majesty, we can ask other countries for help. Ask for help? But who has the ability to save us now? King Hans said dejectedly. France, Your Majesty, France is the most powerful country in Europe. I am willing to go to France in person and ask the King of France to send troops to support Denmark. But, my dear minister, what reason does France have to rescue Denmark? King Hans asked doubtfully. There is no love or hatred without reason in this world. If you want others to save you, you must have an excuse to make the other party tempted. Your Majesty, I heard that the French had a grudge against Marin. The previous king was defeated by Marin. Although the current king has no big grudge against Marin, he definitely doesn't want to see that little thief Marin have an easy life. You mean, take advantage of the hatred between France and the county of East Frisia? King Hans seemed to understand a little. Yes, take advantage of their hatred. But that's not enough. We need to pay something else. For example, we need to pay for their troops. That's no problem. As long as they are willing to send troops, I will sell everything I have to satisfy them. In addition, I remember that your majesty once formed an alliance with the Grand Duchy of Moscow to deal with Sweden together. Eriksson suddenly mentioned something. Yes, how could I forget them? King Hans suddenly realized. In 1493, King Hans once formed an alliance with the Grand Duchy of Moscow and invited the Grand Duchy of Moscow to attack Sweden from the direction of Finland to distract Sweden's attention. Finally, in 1497, King Hans conquered Sweden, which had always been dissatisfied with him. Of course, Sweden has rebelled again now. Yes, I have also heard that the Grand Duchy of Moscow has a large number of troops. When they fought against the Golden Horde, they dispatched 200,000 troops. Army Minister Simonson also slapped his head and said. Indeed, when Ahmad Khan led his army to attack the Grand Duchy of Moscow, Ivan III once mobilized 200,000 troops across the country to confront Ahmad Khan's army across the Ugra River. Of course, most of the 200,000 troops of the Grand Duchy of Moscow were forcibly conscripted farmers, and the real elite were only 10,000 or 20,000 people. Facing tens of thousands of Mongolian cavalry from the Golden Horde, the 200,000 troops of the Grand Duchy of Moscow dared not move, but just held on to confront the other side. In the end, Ahmad Khan was frightened and withdrew. Otherwise, the Grand Duchy of Moscow would be destroyed. But outsiders don't know, and Ivan III's own boasting makes people think that the Grand Duchy of Moscow is so powerful. So the Danes chose to ally with it and successfully conquered Sweden. Now, King Hans thought that he could use the Muscovite army to contain the Swedish army. In this way, the Danish army could withdraw part of it. So, after sending Foreign Minister Eriksson to France for help, Danish King Hans also sent Deputy Foreign Minister Jansen to Moscow to ask Moscow to send troops to the east of Finland to help contain the Swedish resistance. In return, King Hans allowed the Muscovite army to plunder in Finland. After King Hans arranged diplomatic affairs, Finance Minister Dolson stood up. Your Majesty, have you forgotten someone? Who? Your brother-in-law, Elector Frederick III. This kid didn't try his best to help. King Hans was a little unhappy. As his brother-in-law, when he was in trouble, his brother-in-law only issued a bland statement. What's the difference between that and not helping? Your Majesty, I guess it's probably because of the failure of the Duke of Saxony's army last time that the Elector was very afraid. Dolson said confidently. In that case, why should we count on him? King Hans said unhappily. Your Majesty, as the Elector, Lord Frederick III is still very useful. For example, he can help us recruit German mercenaries. What do you mean? King Hans seemed to have thought of something. Your Majesty, let's levy a batch of war taxes. If we don't levy it now, we may not have the chance in the future. As long as we have money, we can not only afford the cost of the French reinforcements, but also use the money to ask Lord Frederick III to recruit 10,000 to 20,000 mercenaries in the German region to participate in the defense, so as not to let the enemy easily ravage our land. Dawson said sincerely. Speaking of which, Denmark's financial situation has always been good. However, in order to suppress the resistance of Sweden, it cost a lot, and now there is not much left. However, Dawson's idea of levying a batch of war taxes is a good idea. There are no ordinary regular taxes in Europe at this time, only commercial taxes and tariffs are regular taxes. And those nobles and merchants, if they don't have commercial activities, don't have to pay taxes at ordinary times. But there is a special situation, that is, when encountering a war, the king can convene parliament and seek authorization from parliament to levy war taxes to meet the needs of the war. Normally, it is difficult to get parliament to agree to levy taxes, and King Hans didn't think of this for a while. But now it is different. If we don't find a way, Denmark may perish. In response, Jonathan, the Grand Speaker of the Parliament who was present at the meeting, nodded solemnly and responded, Your Majesty, I will do my best to get this resolution passed by the Parliament. In this way, after discussion, the Danish monarch and his ministers decided on 3 major strategies: asking for help, raising taxes, and hiring new mercenaries to deal with the desperate situation Denmark was facing. Chapter 93, Western and French Enmity. Just when the Danish monarchs and ministers were planning to use the power of France and the Grand Duchy of Moscow to save Denmark, they didn't know that the French were also in trouble. It turned out that after the signing of the Treaty of Granada, France and Spain divided the Kingdom of Naples. The French occupied the northern part of the Kingdom of Naples, including the city of Naples. The Spanish, on the other hand, occupied part of the southernmost part of the Apennine Peninsula. Strictly speaking, the Spaniards suffered a loss and the French took advantage. After all, France is the most powerful country in Europe. And Spain, on land, is not as strong as the Holy Roman Empire and Poland. Of course, this is when the cheating Turkey does not participate in the evaluation. However, when the Treaty of Granada was signed, an area called Capitanata at the junction of the two territories was ignored. However, this Capitanata is a very important area. The land there is fertile and it is an excellent grassland. Of course, this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that it is a huge valley and an important area for traveling from south to north on the Apennine Peninsula. The cattle breeding industry in the Kingdom of Naples is relatively developed. Every winter and summer, a large number of cattle will pass through the Capitanata area, heading north for summer or south for winter. When a large number of cattle pass through this place, local officials can set up checkpoints to collect transit taxes, and the amount is not small. In this era when the king can only rely on collecting tariffs, commercial taxes, city entry taxes and transit taxes are definitely a fortune that cannot be ignored. Moreover, more importantly, both France and Spain are very unwilling to share the rich Kingdom of Naples with each other. As a result, the two countries had a dispute over the Capitanata area, where a large amount of taxes can be levied, and neither of them was willing to give in. Originally, the French had the upper hand. Because there are so many French people. France is too strong, with as many as 20,000 regular heavy cavalry alone, not counting infantry. Moreover, they can also recruit Swiss mercenaries to fight, which is considered a top power at the level of the European leader. However, Spain is not bad either. In particular, Gonzalo de Cordova had previously gone to East Frisia to learn the famous Marin phalanx from Marin. The biggest feature of the Marin phalanx is that it can restrain heavy cavalry. Therefore, the Spaniards are not afraid of the French. Although Gonzalo de Cordova only has 10,000 men, most of whom are infantry, he is not afraid of the French. As early as last winter, he began to boldly confront the French army for transit taxes. When the news reached Paris, France, Louis XII was very unhappy. Moreover, he had long thought of kicking Spain out of the Kingdom of Naples. Therefore, Louis XII temporarily suspended his support for the confrontation between the Swiss and the Emperor, and hired 13,000 Swiss mercenaries from Switzerland. This move temporarily paused the Swiss offensive against the Graubünden region controlled by Maximilian I, and also relieved the Emperor. In addition, Louis XII also planned to hire 17,000 Italian mercenaries from Italy, and then draw 10,000 French heavy cavalry from the mainland to gather 40,000 troops to go south to fight Spain, and then completely drive the Spaniards out of the Kingdom of Naples. When Danish Foreign Minister Eriksson arrived in Paris, Louis XII had already planned to lead the army south. So, when the French had a war to fight, the Danes' dream of getting military support from France was shattered. However, Louis XII did not want Marin to be arrogant. Although he could not directly send troops to support Denmark. However, the French generously allocated 56-pound breech-loading bronze cannons and a large amount of gunpowder and shells from the arsenal to Denmark to help Denmark guard Copenhagen. In addition, Louis XII also lent 200,000 gold coins to Danish King Hans, encouraging him to hire more mercenaries to fight against the four-nation coalition. With this money, the Danes had no problem recruiting 10,000 troops. The most important thing is that 10,000 troops, if put in the wild, may not be the opponent of the 30,000 coalition forces commanded by Marin. However, it is enough to guard Copenhagen, which has tall and solid walls. After all, there are tens of thousands of troops. Sending thousands of people to block the city gate can block the city gate. In this way, Eriksson left France with a little disappointment. However, he did not return empty-handed. With so many artillery ammunition and 200,000 gold coins that can hire tens of thousands of mercenaries, he can give an explanation when he goes back. However, it is inevitable that he is a little disappointed that he did not get the expected support from the French army. In fact, what Eriksson did not know was that the musketeers under Marin were specifically designed to restrain the French knights. Even if France sent a large army to support Denmark, it might not be effective. The French did not come to support Denmark, so they still escaped. However, the French army will face the 10,000 Spanish army that also uses the Marin phalanx when it goes south, and it will not be good. Because, since Gonzalo de Córdoba returned from his studies, he had been training his 10,000 troops in the Marin square for a year or two. Moreover, Ferdinand II generously equipped him with 50 rear-loading bronze cannons, which further enhanced their firepower. That's not all. Since Columbus acted as a guide and brought back a large amount of spices from India with the Spanish fleet, the Spanish kings made a profit of hundreds of thousands of gold coins by selling spices and suddenly became rich. So, Ferdinand II, who had money, ordered to hire another 10,000 Spanish mercenaries, passing through Sicily and sending them to the Spanish-controlled area of the Kingdom of Naples to accept the command of Gonzalo de Córdoba. Intelligence sent back from Paris showed that King Louis XII of France led more than 20,000 troops to the south. He didn't know that Louis XII had already sent people to Italy to recruit tens of thousands of mercenaries. Since he had money, Ferdinand II was unwilling to admit defeat. So, he increased his troops by 10,000, intending to have a good fight with the French in the Kingdom of Naples. It would be best if he could defeat the French and drive them out of the Kingdom of Naples completely. Just like that, while the war was raging in northern Europe, the two powers of Italy, France and Spain in southern Europe also began to secretly accumulate strength, each wanting to drive the other away and take over the Kingdom of Naples alone. In order to build momentum for the conflict, the kings of Spain and France have begun to accuse each other of provocation through diplomatic documents, in order to find an excuse for their own military action. It would be best if they could stand on the side of justice. Chapter 94, Ambitious Vasily III. The Danes failed to ask France for help, but they got good news from the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Of course, it was good news on the surface. As early as last year, the current Grand Duke Ivan III was paralyzed in bed due to illness. Therefore, the regent now is his son Prince Vasily, who later became Vasily III. Vasily III, like Ivan III, is an ambitious mousy chief. However, although Ivan III has great ambitions, he is relatively timid. When he confronted Ahmad Khan of the Golden Horde in 1480, he was so scared that he fled back to Moscow. Vasily III is also ambitious, but he is much bolder and more ruthless. Prince Vasily is the son of Ivan III and his second wife, Sophia, the sister of Andreas Palaiologos, the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. Originally, Ivan III had an eldest son named Ivan Ivanovich with his ex-wife. Moreover, Ivan III originally planned to pass the throne to his eldest son. Unfortunately, Prince Ivan died as early as 1490, leaving only a son named Dmitry. Originally, the nobles of the Grand Duchy of Moscow all supported Dmitry's grandson to succeed to the throne. However, in 1502, for some unknown reason, Dmitry was probably suspected of murdering Prince Vasily and was arrested by Ivan III. Then, Ivan III happened to be paralyzed in bed, so he simply let Prince Vasily be regent. In fact, there are many speculations about the sudden arrest of Dmitry's grandson. Because Dmitry's grandson is a somewhat timid and cowardly young man, it is unlikely that he would murder his uncle. Many people speculate that the reason why Ivan III finally chose Prince Vasily and abandoned Dmitry's grandson may be because of his personality. Ivan III is an ambitious monarch who hopes to see the continuous growth of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. The honest and timid Dmitry is more than good at defending the status quo, but not aggressive enough. In addition, Dmitry was secretly controlled by his mother, the Crown Princess Irene, which made Ivan III quite unhappy. Moreover, his wife Sophia and Prince Vasily kept lobbying Ivan III, saying that if Prince Vasily inherited the Grand Duke position of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, because he had the blood of the Eastern Roman royal family and the Eastern Roman Empire had perished, Prince Vasily could use this as an excuse to claim that the Grand Duchy of Moscow inherited the Eastern Roman Empire. As for the fact that Sophia's brother Andreas Palaiologos sold the throne to Maximilian I, who cared? As long as the Grand Duchy of Moscow refused to recognize it at that time. Not only that, although Prince Vasily had launched a rebellion, it was only to snatch the position of Crown Prince from Prince Dmitry. This also proved that Prince Vasily was a daring person. Unlike Prince Dmitry, some were too honest and cowardly, and were easily framed as puppets by the great nobles. Therefore, after repeated ideological struggles, Ivan III finally chose Prince Vasily to be regent and replaced Dmitry as crown prince. In fact, both Prince Vasily and Prince Dmitry are not very old, but not young either. Prince Vasily was born in 1479, while Prince Dmitry was born in 1483. Today, Prince Vasily is 24 years old, and Prince Dmitry is 20 years old. Although he is only 1 year younger than Marin, Prince Vasily's ambition is no less than Marin's. What's more, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which he is about to inherit, is much stronger than the East Frisian county. Marin's East Frisian county has only 3,000 square kilometers and a population of 150,000, excluding the army. The Grand Duchy of Moscow now has 2 to 3 million square kilometers of land and a population of several million. Although, because most of the land area is too far north, it is not very suitable for human habitation. But the land in some areas in the south alone is enough to beat Marin in comparison. Therefore, they are also qualified to be arrogant. Except for the powerful Crimean Khanate in the south and the alliance of Lithuania and Poland in the west, which is not easy to mess with, Prince Vasily is plotting in other directions. Prince Vasily has also studied Denmark. It turns out that Denmark is a maritime hegemon and a weak chicken on land. Although it may be blocked by the sea if Denmark's territory is touched, so what? The Grand Duchy of Moscow has no maritime interests at all and is purely a landlubber country. It's just that, because of the reputation of the Danish Kalmar Union, it dared not act rashly for a while. But now, the Danes actually took the initiative to come to the door and want to attack Finland by themselves, and they also robbed it casually. Prince Vasily was tempted at once. When the matter was reported to Ivan III, who was paralyzed in bed, Ivan III was also somewhat tempted. Not only Ivan III was tempted, but the nobles of the Grand Duchy of Moscow were also very tempted. Because, in the eyes of the nobles of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, Sweden, as an emerging country, although it has some strength, it can never be compared with the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Now, it should be no problem to attack the rebellious Sweden with the Danes. However, the Mauzi who were out of touch with the news did not know that the Danes were already in trouble and their homeland was about to be invaded. Because the Mauzi were in the easternmost part of Europe and were not in the sphere of influence of the Catholic Church, they were a little out of touch with the news and did not know the development of the war on the Jutland Peninsula. Therefore, the Mauzi nobles unanimously decided to send 20,000 troops to enter and exit Finland. Then, they looted Finland wantonly. These Mauzi nobles were very keen on killing and arson. Perhaps they were deeply influenced by the original suzerain, the Golden Horde, and the Mauzi army always had a style of burning, killing and looting. Later, the Cossacks took this barbaric style to the extreme. When they heard that they would take advantage of the stalemate between Denmark and Sweden to march into Finland and rob a lot of money, many Mauzi nobles signed up enthusiastically. Prince Vasily, the regent, selected several nobles who were closest to him and asked them to recruit 20,000 troops from the country and prepare to set off to plunder Finland. As for supplies, Prince Vasily didn't even consider it. When the time comes, just let them eat anywhere. The so-called eat anywhere means relying on robbing the locals' property and food as supplies. However, for those ordinary people who were robbed, it is very unfortunate. All the food and property were robbed, and it was difficult to have hope of survival. But what does that have to do with the Russians? They only know that it is enough for them to get rich. As for the life and death of the Finnish people, it is not within their consideration. In fact, the ambitious Prince Vasily is not just thinking about robbing. Even the ambitious Prince Vasily plans to steal part of Finland's territory after the war. At the very least, the territory near the Grand Duchy of Moscow and the Baltic Sea must be swallowed up. By then, the Grand Duchy of Moscow will no longer be a landlubber country. Maybe, it can also engage in maritime trade, do some business and make some money. Chapter 95, The Navy sets out again. A month of rest and repair time passed in a blink of an eye. The East Frisian fleet, the Hamburg fleet and the Lübeck fleet were all ready to annihilate the Danish fleet in one battle. Therefore, the three fleets gathered at their respective ports, ready to go to Copenhagen to destroy the remaining 80 Danish warships. At the Emden naval port, Fleet Commander-in-Chief Kidd led 8 warships, 14 armed merchant ships and 17 carracks equipped with artillery, ready to set sail. On the dock, the military band played "Conquering the Ocean," adapted from "Conquering Heaven," and the sailors followed the lead singing and sang loudly in Latin, "Ideals make us strong to break through the obstacles of darkness. Ideals make us strong and never give up hope. Through tears, we can see the twinkling stars. Through wind and rain, follow the light of life." Then, the lead singer from the church led everyone to sing loudly in German and Frisian, which is similar to English. In the majestic music, the sailors were all excited, their eyes were full of determination and hope. Columbus, who came to see him off, also sang loudly with the sailors, with tears already flowing down his face. Because he knew that this song was clearly praising his feat of discovering the wild continent and exploring India. Kidd did not take Columbus with him on this expedition. Because Kidd knew that Columbus had other important things to do and could not be damaged in the naval battle. Otherwise, it would destroy Marin's plan. Coincidentally, after a month of training, the sailors and gunners were also familiar with the performance of the 17 carracks bought from Spain. And Kidd himself also knew how to command these carracks. So, he left Columbus behind and took his fleet to join the Hamburg fleet. In the outer port of Hamburg, Cuxhaven, the East Frisian fleet was warmly welcomed. Rolf, the commander of the Hamburg fleet, directly joined the East Frisian fleet with 100 warships ready to go. Originally, Hamburg had only 90 warships, and lost 19 warships in the naval battle. However, because more than 80 Danish warships were captured at once, and the East Frisian fleet did not ask for a share of the profits. Therefore, Hamburg selected a batch of Danish warships and added them to the fleet, making up 100 warships. If it were not for the lack of sailors familiar with naval warfare, Hamburg would even want to get more warships out. The people of Hamburg are very confident about destroying the Danish fleet this time. Because, last time, 120 Danish warships were annihilated, so why are they afraid of the remaining 80? Moreover, this time, Hamburg not only has 100 warships, but also 110 warships from Lübeck and 39 warships from East Frisia to help. 249 warships against 80, 3 against 1, there is no possibility of not winning. Therefore, there were crowds of people in Cuxhaven, and many Hamburg people came to see off the fleet and look forward to the joint fleet annihilating the Danish navy. Because the Danes have found too many problems with the Hanseatic League over the years. Moreover, no Hanseatic city is a match for Denmark. If they were to unite, the second strongest Hamburg fleet in the alliance would not be able to break through the Danish waters to join the fleet of the boss Lübeck. Just like the last naval battle, when the Danes heard that the Hamburg fleet was going to join the Lübeck fleet, they would definitely try their best to stop it. Moreover, they would probably treat the Hamburg fleet as a soft persimmon and squeeze it first. Fortunately, in the last naval battle, the East Frisian fleet appeared behind the Danish fleet in a very wretched manner, and sank many Danish warships with terrifying heavy artillery, forcing the Danish fleet to surrender. In fact, it was also a fluke that the last naval battle ended so quickly. If the commander of the Danish fleet, Alkinson, had not been killed by chance, the morale of the Danes would not have collapsed. Even if they were defeated, the combined fleet would have broken its teeth. Unfortunately, the unlucky Alkinson was killed with a musket. As soon as he died, the captains and sailors of the Danish fleet were immediately at a loss. As soon as someone took the lead in hanging the white flag, they followed suit. If Alkinson hadn't been stupid and insisted on fighting the East Frisian fleet, the naval battle wouldn't have ended so quickly. In fact, if the Danish fleet had rushed into the Hamburg fleet and fought with the Hamburg warships, the East Frisian fleet might have been cautious. Because, if you fire the gun carelessly, you might hurt the Hamburg fleet. But Alkinson didn't understand. He had never fought a naval battle with a fleet that used artillery as its main weapon. He rashly took some warships to approach the East Frisian fleet full of heavy artillery. It was obvious that he was tired of living. In order to test new tactics in this naval battle, the Hamburgers moved the expensive 8 18-pound bronze cannons ordered from Marin last time to the warships, and tested the use of naval guns to shoot and attack enemy ships in the naval battle. Seeing what the Hamburgers did, Kid tried hard not to laugh out loud. Because he knew very well that the cannons on the East Frisian warships, except for the 17 Clark ships bought from Spain equipped with bronze cannons sold by the Spaniards, were all cast iron cannons on other self-produced warships. It's just that the clever Earl painted the surface of the cannons with copper paint, making them look like copper cannons. However, the cost of the two is simply a world of difference. In fact, Kid didn't know that because Marin instructed the craftsmen of the second gun foundry to use the Rodman endomembrane cooling method, the success rate of the 18-pound heavy cannons of the second gun foundry has increased from less than 20% to more than 80%, which is more than 4 times higher, and it also saves a lot of costs. In this era, the price ratio of copper to iron in Europe reached 1 to 10. This is when the price of iron in Europe is very high. But in fact, in East Frisia, which uses blast furnaces and coking coal, the cost price of iron is less than 1/20th of copper, which is half lower than the market price. Therefore, the cost of an 18-pound bronze cannon of Hamburgers can be cast by East Frisia 20 cast iron cannons. A 250 class armed merchant ship can only be equipped with 20 guns in total. In other words, the cost of equipping a Hamburger with an 18-pounder cannon is enough for the East Frisians to equip a ship. Of course, Kid couldn't say it, as Marin had strictly ordered it to be kept secret. As an ally, Kid also enthusiastically selected a group of experienced artillerymen to go to Hamburg's warships to command Hamburg's artillerymen on how to use 18-pound heavy guns in naval battles, which made the Hamburgers very happy. However, when selecting artillerymen to go to the Hamburg warships, Kid deliberately selected gunners who were good at keeping their mouths shut, so as not to expose the core military secret that East Frisian warships are all cast iron. In a friendly atmosphere, 39 East Frisian warships and 100 Hamburg warships slowly sailed away from Cuxhaven in Hamburg and headed for the Danish waters. At the same time, in the port of Lübeck on the Baltic coast, 110 Lübeck warships were also ready to go north, intending to meet with the Allied fleet in the Øresund Strait, and then attack the military port of Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, together, striving to destroy the last assets of the Danish navy. Chapter 96 Your Majesty, let's change the Iron Gate. Marin's siege tactics were as easy as drinking water, which made the Danes panic. Of course, by chance, the Danes figured out his three-pronged strategy. The Danish royal palace once again held a royal meeting to discuss countermeasures because of Marin's siege tactics. Knight Heisen, are you saying that Marin, that bastard, relied on artillery to attack the city without sending people to climb the city wall? King Hans was surprised after listening to the report from the spy Heisen. Because this was not in line with the convention. Moreover, Marin's speed of breaking the city was too fast. He took down a city in just a few days, as easy as eating and drinking water. It was really scary. Yes, I escaped from Flensburg in the Duchy of Schleswig. Before, I never figured it out, but in Flensburg, I saw with my own eyes the devilish methods of Marin, which were indeed different from others. They first used dozens of heavy artillery to concentrate on bombarding the city gate. After a big hole was blown in the oak door, they stuffed gunpowder into the hole and blew up the city gate. Then, the enemy's army poured into the city like a tide. Recalling that scene, Knight Heisen is still terrified. If Knight Heisen had not taken off his armor in time and hid in the toilet of a civilian house after the city was broken, he would have been captured as a prisoner. Later, while Marin's army continued to move north and the city's defenses were relaxed, Knight Heisen disguised himself as a beggar, escaped all the way from Flensburg, found a fishing boat, and returned to his hometown, Zealand. Knight Heisen was a native of Zealand, and was sent to garrison Flensburg as one of the adjutants of the local garrison general. After escaping back, Heisen understood that if he could not make meritorious deeds to atone for his sins, his knighthood and fiefdom would be in danger of being taken back by the court. So he ran to Copenhagen, and in the name of a survivor, in front of the ministers, he reported to the Danish king Hans about Marin's siege tactics that he had witnessed with his own eyes. What a powerful tactic! Although the method of burying gunpowder cannot shake the city wall, it is no problem to blow up the oak door and the bricks and wood piled behind the oak door. Commented Simonson, the minister of the army. Of course, that was Simonson's lack of knowledge. Even if the city wall is built firmly, it can be blown down if enough gunpowder is buried under the city wall. If one barrel of gunpowder cannot blow up a solid city wall, then dozens of barrels. Knight Heisen, do you mean that the other party must blow a hole in the city gate before burying the gunpowder barrel? Navy Minister Thomason frowned and asked. Yes, that's right. I heard from the soldiers who escaped from Schleswig that every time the enemy would blow a hole in the city gate before stuffing the gunpowder barrels in. If there was no hole, it seemed that the gunpowder barrels would not be used. So, that means the gunpowder barrels must be placed in the hole to explode? Thomason asked. I don't know either. Heisen had only seen this scene, but didn't understand the reason. That's it, let's find a big door to try. Foreign Minister Eriksson suggested. This time Eriksson brought back 200,000 gold coins, 50 bronze cannons, and a lot of gunpowder and shells from France. He took out a few barrels of gunpowder to try, but nothing happened. So, King Hans of Denmark, with his ministers, went outside the city and asked a count to borrow 2 doors from a castle in the suburbs of Copenhagen, and started the experiment. Behind the 2 doors, there were things piled up like a siege scene, blocking the door. However, one gate was intact, while the other gate had a carpenter drill a large hole in the middle of the gate with tools to facilitate the placement of gunpowder barrels. It took dozens of carpenters half a day to drill a large hole in the middle of the thick castle gate to accommodate the gunpowder barrels. Then, the 2 gates were tested for gunpowder barrel explosions. After 2 loud noises of boom boom, the Danish ministers saw different scenes. In the explosion test without digging a hole and only placing the gunpowder barrels outside the gate, although the gate was damaged, there was still no problem with the gate. After all, the more you hold back on bombs, the stronger they will explode. Gunpowder can be used as a bomb when placed in an iron can, but it can only be used as a firecracker when placed in a paper bag. And the gunpowder barrel was thrown into the castle gate with a hole to explode. The huge impact force broke down the heavy castle gate from the inside. Of course, the bricks and stones piled up behind were also hit hard, but they did not collapse. This is because the Danes used powdered gunpowder. The Marin army, especially the artillery, has promoted the use of granular gunpowder. Only the musketeers, because of the problem of the production of granular gunpowder, are still using powdered gunpowder for the time being. Those gunpowder barrels used to blow up the city gates were naturally taken from the artillery, and they were naturally granulated gunpowder, and the explosive power was 2 or 3 times stronger than powdered black powder. Therefore, the effect is naturally better. Although powdered gunpowder was used and the burial degree was not good, the Danish ministers could see in the experiment that the gunpowder barrels stuffed into the city gate hole still overturned the heavy oak city gate. Therefore, the Danish monarchs and ministers present came to a conclusion that the oak city gate, which is basically unsolvable for Marin's rogue siege tactics, will definitely be broken. Once the city gate is broken, unless the defenders in the city are no less than the attackers, and no less powerful than the attackers, otherwise, the fall of the city is almost inevitable. What should I do? What should I do? King Hans of Denmark was nervous. If this siege method has no solution, then the fall of the cities on the Jutland Peninsula is only a matter of time. Moreover, the time will be very short. Even if the coalition forces attack Zealand Island and besiege Copenhagen, this method can also successfully blow up the gates of Copenhagen. Then, Hans may become a prisoner. Thinking of this, King Hans was trembling with fear, afraid of the arrival of that day. Back in the palace, the ministers were thinking about countermeasures. Faced with such a complicated situation, everyone was a little sad. Finance Minister Dolsen's eyes began to wander. He didn't understand military affairs and was only responsible for appropriation. Every time the army was allocated funds, it was a quarrel. Since he didn't understand, he simply didn't bother to give suggestions. However, after seeing the inner hall door covered with a golden skin for showing off, Dolsen's eyes suddenly lit up. "Your Majesty, I have an idea." "My dear, tell me, how to deal with it." Hans looked at Dolsen, a layman who didn't understand military affairs, with expectation. "Your Majesty, let's replace the city gate with an iron gate." "Iron gate?" King Hans was stunned. "Yes, I heard from Knight Heisen that the enemy used artillery to bombard the Oak City Gate, and it took at least half a day. If it is replaced with an iron city gate, can the enemy still blow it open?" Dolsen said excitedly. "Iron gate, artillery. Oh, what a good idea." Navy Minister Thomason thought about it, slapped his thigh and said excitedly. "Then, let's try it." Foreign Minister Eriksson said. "Okay, let's try it. Come on, go find all the blacksmiths in the city, I want them to build a heavy iron gate together." Just like that, all the blacksmiths in Copenhagen were summoned by the royal family, and they were ordered to use iron to build a sturdy city gate for testing. Chapter 97, The Navy's Attack Frustrated. Because the remaining Danish naval fleets all retreated into the narrow Copenhagen Bay, and there were basically no Danish warships outside, the East Frisian and Hamburg joint fleets, with almost no obstruction along the way, successfully passed through the Øresund Strait and joined the Lübeck fleet outside the Copenhagen port. Everyone was full of confidence, and they did not take the remaining Danish fleet retreating in the narrow Copenhagen Bay seriously. So, several Lübeck warships took the lead and rushed into the Copenhagen Bay, which was like a narrow canal. However, the first batch of 4 Lübeck warships that rushed in were beaten out in a very embarrassing way, and 2 ships were burned. It's not that the Danish warships anchored in the Copenhagen Bay showed their power, but that the Danish soldiers guarding both sides of the river showed their power. Originally, there were only 9,000 Danish sailors on the remaining 80 Danish warships. At this time, the Danish Navy Minister knew that if it was a warship duel, these 80 warships would definitely not be the opponent of the coalition forces. So Thomason simply let the sailors get off the warships, carrying weapons such as catapults and bows and arrows, and directly guarded the 2 ends of the river channel of Copenhagen Bay, which was similar to a canal, to prevent any warships from entering and prevent the warships from being destroyed. In order to ensure safety, the Danes also built a temporary fortress at the estuary as a shelter to protect the safety of the Danish sailors deployed there. In this way, there are more than 4,000 soldiers and horses at each end of the estuary, which is considered very strong. And the narrow river channel of Copenhagen Bay can only allow 3 or 4 ships to enter at a time, and it is very crowded and close to the shore. In this way, the Danish sailors on the shore have a lot of room for attack. The catapults on the shore threw fireballs directly at the Lübeck warships, and the Danish archers also shot rockets at the Lübeck warships. What's more, many Danish sailors threw torches directly at the Lübeck warships near the shore. Because the warships were too close to the shore, it was convenient for the sailors to throw torches. In this way, under such circumstances, 2 of the first 4 Lübeck warships that rushed in were burned in an instant. Many parts of the warships that were not burned were also burned and damaged. The coalition fleet was a little dumbfounded. Seeing that the entrance to this narrow river was so dangerous, everyone was a little at a loss. Then, Kidd led the East Frisian warships to go out. Facing the Danish fortress at the estuary, the East Frisian fleet pointed its guns at them. However, after a bombardment, it was found that the effect was also limited. It turned out that the Danish fortifications made of stones were very solid, and even artillery bombardment was difficult to work. What's more, this time the Danes dug a lot of tunnels, and most of the personnel hid in tunnels similar to trenches. In fact, the Danes didn't know that the tunnels could prevent artillery bombardment very well. It was just that when building fortifications, they dug a lot of tunnels temporarily to save trouble. Unexpectedly, the effect of resisting artillery bombardment was excellent. Under the bombardment, many of the Danish catapults deployed on the ground were destroyed. However, because the personnel hid in the tunnels, there were not many casualties. When the Lübeck warships saw that the catapults were destroyed and tried to enter the river again, the Danes came out again to shoot rockets and throw torches. And when the East Frisian warships came up to bombard again, they retreated into the tunnel again. Then, the commanders of the combined fleet didn't know what to do. The three commanders held a 2-day meeting, but failed to come up with a suitable solution. Then, the combined fleet was deadlocked there, surrounding Copenhagen without fighting. At the critical moment, it was Kidd who thought of his own earl, who was a wise man with a lot of strategies. Therefore, Kidd sent 2 warships to Abbenrao, a port on the east side of the Jutland Peninsula that had been occupied by Marin, and wrote a letter to Marin for advice. In fact, Marin was stationed in Ribe with a large army at the moment. However, Abbenrao is not far from Ribe. A group of second-line troops left behind in Benra, selected from the militia, with certain military skills. The cities of the Duchy of Schleswig that Marin conquered along the way were all garrisoned by militia, and these militia had received military training, immediately sent someone to pass the message to Marin in the nearby city of Ribe. Marin spread out the map and observed carefully for a while, and found that there was only one way to deal with the defenders on the Danish shore, that is, to send ground troops to deal with the Danish sailors guarding both ends of the river. Although the Danish sailors guarding both ends of the river had an advantage against warships, they were a bit exhausted when they encountered ground troops. As long as the ground troops were arranged to land from other places on Zealand Island and then surround them from the side, they could completely wipe out the Danish sailors stationed at both ends of the river. Moreover, once these Danish sailors stationed at the mouth of the river were completely wiped out, then the 80 Danish warships would have no sailors to operate. In this way, the coalition forces could capture the 80 Danish warships effortlessly. Soon, this plan was sent to Kidd. Seeing Marin's plan, the 3 commanders were very sure of Marin's plan. However, Lübeck and Hamburg hesitated on the issue of arranging the landing. The main reason was that Lübeck and Hamburg were unwilling to let the sailors participate in the landing battle and land attack and defense battle with heavy casualties. You know, both Lübeck and Hamburg are Hanseatic cities that rely on maritime trade. Warships and sailors are their foundation. If these sailors are allowed to land and then attack, there will definitely be heavy casualties. Therefore, the fleet commanders of Lübeck and Hamburg all hope that the task of landing and attacking will be handed over to the army. Kidd is certainly not happy. After all, the main force of the army is the family property of his own East Frisian state. Therefore, after intense discussions, the 3 decided to let the mercenary infantry hired by Hamburg and Lübeck serve as the vanguard of landing and attacking to conquer the Danish sailors guarding the estuary. Anyway, those mercenaries were not from Lübeck and Hamburg, but were hired from outside. Lübeck and Hamburg were reluctant to let their own sailors fight, but they were willing to let those mercenaries fight. Then, the fleet commanders of Lübeck and Hamburg respectively sent this idea back to Lübeck and Hamburg, waiting for the approval of their respective parliaments. Marin also received Kidd's report. Although Marin despised the approach of Lübeck and Hamburg, he also thought it was a good idea. Sailors are sailors after all. Whether it is the sailors of Lübeck and Hamburg or the sailors of Denmark, they are actually not good at ground offensive and defensive battles. To be honest, even the mercenaries of the East Frisian state are not very good at the kind of head-on ground offensive and defensive battles. Because they all rely on firearms to win. For the Danish sailors who dug tunnels, Marin's artillery and musketeers were somewhat helpless. For this reason, Marin was very much in favor of the approach proposed by Lübeck and Hamburg to let the mercenaries they hired take the lead. Moreover, the most crucial point is that once Marin's army eliminated the thousands of Danish sailors guarding the estuary, they could take advantage of the situation to surround Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. If Copenhagen was captured and the Danish king Hans was captured, the war would be over. Therefore, Marin decisively changed his strategy, temporarily stopped attacking other areas of Jutland Island, and landed on Zealand Island instead, first eliminating the Danish sailors and capturing Danish warships, then surrounding Copenhagen, trying to capture the Danish king alive, and forcing him to sign an unequal treaty to cede land. Chapter 98, Preparations before landing. The parliaments of the 2 cities of Lübeck and Hamburg quickly approved the plan to use army mercenaries to attack the Danish sailor positions on both sides of the Copenhagen Bay. After receiving the news, the joint fleet immediately passed the news to Marin. However, Marin did not immediately organize the crossing, but asked the joint fleet to clean up all the waters around Zealand Island first. Especially the sea area from the Jutland Peninsula to Zealand Island, the sea surface must be cleaned up, and there must not be a Danish ship. If you encounter it, all will be seized. In fact, this is a hint to the joint fleet to rob Danish civilian ships. The Kingdom of Denmark is not only a naval power, but there are also many Danish civilian ships. There are many merchant ships and fishing boats. Fishing boats are fine, but those merchant ships are all competitors of the Hanseatic League. After hearing Marin's arrangement, the fleet commanders of Lübeck and Hamburg all understood. Then, the joint fleet only left half of the warships to monitor the Copenhagen Bay, and the other ships all went to the vicinity of Zealand Island to clean up the sea surface. When these warships encountered merchant ships, they immediately swarmed up and stopped them. If it is found that the merchant ship belongs to Denmark, it will be seized without saying anything. Then, the sailors on the ship will temporarily become coolies, and the merchant ship itself will be confiscated directly. In particular, the joint fleet blocked the Great Belt Strait west of Zealand Island, cutting off the connection between Zealand Island and other Danish islands. Whether it is a fishing boat or a ferry, it is forbidden to go to sea. Once discovered, the ship will either be seized or sunk. However, everyone found that it was too inconvenient to transport the Allied army from Abbenrao to Zealand Island. Because there are Funen Island and some densely populated small islands in the middle, which greatly affects the safety of navigation. So Marin made a decision. The army continued to move north, captured the northern port city of Vale, and boarded a ship to cross the east. The city of Vale is not big, but it is an important port. It mainly exports livestock produced in the Jutland Peninsula and is an important livestock export and wholesale market. Denmark's core island of Zealand also relies more on the meat and fur of livestock produced in the Jutland Peninsula imported from Vale. Before, Marin sent cavalry to rob horses everywhere, and also robbed an important horse farm belonging to the Danish royal family outside the city of Vale, and took away 1,800 horses. Among them, there are more than 800 good horses that have been trained to be war horses. According to the captured horse farm owner, 500 war horses trained in the horse farm have been sent to the city of Vale, waiting for the Danish royal family to send ships to Zealand to supply the Danish army. However, because of the war, the Danish fleet has retreated to the Bay of Copenhagen and cannot come to transport horses. In other words, the 500 war horses are still stranded in the city of Vale. Not only that, there are still many cattle and sheep in the city of Vale. Most of these cattle and sheep are to be transported to Zealand to become beef and mutton on the tables of Copenhagen nobles and civilians. However, because of the war, transportation has been suspended at present. It happened that there were too many obstacles for a Benro to go to Zealand. So Marin simply ordered to capture Vale first. Not only can they obtain a port facing Zealand Island, but they can also intercept the horses, cattle and sheep in the city and make a fortune. Then, Marin assembled the army again and continued to march northward. At this time, the main force of the army was still 30,000 people, but the auxiliary soldiers were all replaced. The 20,000 main forces and 10,000 baggage troops led by Marin have been divided into 5,000 people, stationed in several cities in the Duchy of Schleswig. These baggage troops are different from the baggage troops of Hamburg and Lübeck. They have all received several months of military training and can barely be regarded as recruits. It may be a bit of a problem to let them fight against the enemy's soldiers, but it is not a big problem to use them to garrison the captured cities. After all, the rural nobles around the city have been cleared by the army. On the other hand, the troops stationed in several cities in the Duchy of Holstein in Lübeck and Hamburg were later transferred from the mainland, and did not split the original 10,000 troops. Therefore, up to now, the main 30,000 troops of the coalition have not changed much. As for Marin, after separating 5,000 baggage troops, he temporarily recruited 5,000 Germans from the southern part of the Duchy of Schleswig to serve as civilian laborers to help the army transport baggage and looted goods. The 30,000-strong army is an unstoppable torrent that crushes all obstacles. Halfway through, the gate of Hadeslev, a small town north of Abbenra, was too fragile. Under the bombardment of more than a dozen heavy artillery, a hole was broken in the gate in less than an hour. The demolition team brought barrels of gunpowder and easily blew up the gate. At this time, behind the gate, the defenders of Hadeslev were still piling bricks and wood behind the gate. As soon as the demolition team blew it up, some defenders were buried under the bricks. There were only 200 defenders in the city, how could they be opponents? As soon as the army entered the city, they surrendered immediately. The entire siege process did not take more than half a day. After looting the official silver vault and the reserves in the granary, Marin took the army away directly, without leaving any garrison here. Because this small town was not his goal. The army continued to move north, arrived in Vale, and surrounded the city. When the coalition arrived in Vale, there were still many fences with livestock next to the port dock outside Vale. As a livestock export port, it is obviously impossible for all livestock to be placed in the city. After all, livestock poop and smell bad. Therefore, most of the livestock are placed in some temporary fences near the dock outside the city, waiting for merchant ships to transport them away. When the coalition captured the port, the fences on the dock were full of horses, cattle and sheep. However, the 500 war horses mentioned in the intelligence were put into the city because they were valuable materials. The livestock on the dock are mostly cattle and sheep, and there are also some draft horses, but they are not too expensive. Marin didn't care whether it was valuable or not. After capturing thousands of cattle and tens of thousands of sheep on the dock, Marin immediately arranged for people to kill some of the cattle and sheep to give the soldiers extra meals. After eating and drinking, the army began to attack the city early the next morning. Although Vale is a livestock export port, the city itself is not very important. Therefore, the city gate is not very thick, but it is much stronger than the gate of Haderslev. After bombing for most of the day, a hole was smashed in the city gate. Then, the demolition team buried thousands of gunpowder barrels. After a loud bang, the east gate of Vale was broken. When the army entered the city, the defenders were divided into two factions. It turned out that there was a guard directly under the Danish royal court in the city, about 100 people. They came here this time to help the royal family select war horses at the royal horse farm outside Vale. This time, they selected 500 war horses and planned to take them back to Copenhagen as special war horses for the royal guard. Unfortunately, before they had time to return to Zealand, they encountered the invasion of the Allied fleet. The Danish navy retreated, and they naturally did not dare to return on ordinary merchant ships, so they were temporarily stranded in the city of Vale. There were only 400 garrisons in the city of Vale. When facing the 30,000-strong coalition army, these local garrisons were scared green. How could they dare to resist? Once the city gate was broken, most of the local defenders chose to surrender. Only the 100 Danish royal guards, out of loyalty to the royal family, chose to resist stubbornly. They retreated into a castle and continued to resist the coalition forces. Marin sent people to launch a total attack on the castle, but he did not expect that these royal guards were so skilled in martial arts that they caused 70 to 80 casualties to the army. Seeing that he could not take the castle for a long time, Marin was angry and withdrew all the troops. After blowing up the castle gate, he threw a lot of firewood into it, and then started a fire. In an instant, the castle was full of smoke. No matter how good the martial arts of these royal guards were, they were smoked to tears. In the end, the remaining 80 royal guards surrendered after losing their combat effectiveness due to the smoke. After surrendering, the captain of the royal guard, Peterson, probably felt that he had no face to face the king of Denmark, and chose a suicidal attack. He was shot into a sieve by the musketeers. Catholicism prohibits suicide, so he could only commit suicide in this way. For such loyal subordinates, although they were enemies, Marin also admired them very much. So Marin personally held a funeral for Captain Peterson and promoted this model of loyalty to the emperor and patriotism to the soldiers. Of course, the living royal guards were not so lucky. They were all put in chains and imprisoned. Moreover, before going to prison, they were all publicly despised. Marin did this to inspire his men's loyalty to the emperor and patriotism. He lifted up the dead Peterson, hoping to set an example for his soldiers to learn more. As for openly despising the captured royal guards, it was also done for his subordinates to see, surrendering traitors will not end well. Chapter 99 Landing. After half a month of cleaning, all the merchant ships in the sea area from Vale to Zealand were robbed by the joint fleet, and the fishing boats were scared and dared not go out to sea. In this case, the time for landing is ripe. According to the fleet's reconnaissance, it was found that there was a coastal town called Kalundborg in the direction of Vale in Zealand, which is also an important port in the northwest of Zealand. So close and so convenient, the coalition forces naturally chose to put the landing site here. For this reason, the coalition dispatched 120 ships to transport large troops. Among these 120 ships, 30 were clearly merchant ships robbed from the Danes. Under the escort of 50 warships, another 40 warships and 30 Danish merchant ships began transportation. Because a lot of personnel, horses and artillery need to be transported, the pressure of transportation is still quite large. Moreover, for the safety of the supply line, Marin also specially left 2,000 East Frisian regular troops to protect the city of Vale to prevent the army from being robbed by the remaining Danish troops on the Jutland Peninsula after leaving. Because they were useless in the siege, 1,000 of the 2,000 troops guarding Vale were the lancers recruited from the Teutonic Empire. With 2,000 troops, the remaining troops on the Jutland Peninsula would definitely not be able to capture Vale. Even if they wanted to cut off the coalition supply line, they had to ask the 1,000 highly skilled lancers whether they were willing. In addition, more than 27,000 troops boarded ships in batches and landed at the port of Kalundborg. Speaking of which, the defenders of Kalundborg were also frustrated, because there were only 200 defenders in the city. Although they saw a large number of enemy troops landing, they could only watch and did not dare to attack out of the city. Because the gap in strength was too great. The first batch of the coalition landing had 1,000 soldiers, including some cavalry. Even if all the soldiers of Kalundborg came out, they could not beat the first batch of soldiers who landed. Even the messenger sent by Kalundborg for help was intercepted and killed by the first batch of cavalry who landed. In desperation, the defenders of Kalundborg could only watch the coalition forces leisurely land, line up, and distribute supplies at the port of Kalundborg. When Marin landed with the artillery unit, Kalundborg's good days were over. After all, Kalundborg is an important foothold and an important link in the supply line. So, after the heavy artillery was pulled up, Marin commanded the army to bombard the city gate. Moreover, because it was close to the sea, this time Marin directly removed 10 long-barreled heavy artillery from the East Frisian warship that came to escort, and the shells had a greater initial velocity and more power. Under the joint bombardment of more than a dozen short-barreled heavy artillery and 10 long-barreled heavy artillery, the gate of Kalundborg was quickly blown down. Yes, it was blown down, and there was no need for the demolition team to come out. The army rushed up and quickly subdued the city defenders who had been scared to pee. Next, Marin ordered the army to repair. At the same time, he sent out 200 scouts, one on 2 horses, to attack everywhere, specifically to kill any locals who rode towards Copenhagen. With deliberate planning, the locals failed to send intelligence to Copenhagen until the army set out the next day. At this time, the Danish monarchs and ministers were replacing the big iron gates of Copenhagen city. After the joint efforts of the blacksmiths in Copenhagen city, the Danes made thick and heavy cast iron city gates. However, this kind of city gate is very difficult to move. Generally speaking, molds are cut near the city gates and then cast on site. After that, a large number of people are dispatched to erect the cast iron city gates and install them in the city gate hole. The craftsmen in Copenhagen are also smart. They used the principle of levers and movable pulleys to successfully transport the cast iron gates weighing several tons into the city gate hole and install them. After that, the Danes conducted many tests, first bombarding them with artillery given by the French, and then burying gunpowder barrels to explode. As a result, the cast iron gate did not move at all, but the bricks and stones on the city wall were blown up a lot. After the test was successful, King Hans of Denmark was very satisfied and ordered that all other gates should be replaced with all cast iron gates to avoid being destroyed by the enemy when the enemy sieges the city. As for the city wall, the Danish monarch and ministers were not worried at all. Because Copenhagen is the first fortress in northern Europe. Although it is right by the sea, it has never been conquered. Even when the Hanseatic League defeated the Danish fleet, it failed to conquer Copenhagen. Otherwise, Denmark would have been finished long ago. Along the way, Marin's army progressed very smoothly. Following the Roman road built by the Danes themselves, the army passed all the way unimpeded. In fact, this was because King Hans of Denmark was afraid that the joint fleet would take the opportunity to attack Copenhagen, so he transferred all the combat-capable knights and veterans on Zealand Island to Copenhagen to assist in defense. Therefore, halfway through, Marin's army did not encounter any resistance. Earlier, when the war just started, Copenhagen had only about 2,500 defenders. But after the dispatch of King Hans of Denmark, there are now 7,000 defenders and 8,000 conscripts in Copenhagen. Most of the armed forces on the entire Zealand Island have been gathered in Copenhagen. Therefore, Marin's army of more than 27,000 did not encounter any decent resistance during the march. Even when he was relaxed, Marin also divided his troops to rob food and property in various towns and manors on Zealand Island. Zealand Island belongs to the Danes anyway, and Marin doesn't feel bad about the people being robbed. He can also hit the opponent's economy, so why not? Before, when attacking the Duchy of Holstein and the Duchy of Schleswig, Marin strictly prohibited his subordinates from robbing the people because they would rule these areas in the future and could not offend the local people. But Denmark's core island of Zealand, whether it is Marin or Lübeck and Hamburg, has no intention of winning the hearts of the local people. Because they are destined to find it difficult to do so. After all, this is the core area of Denmark. So, since it is the core area of the enemy, why should we restrain military discipline and protect the local people who are destined to be at odds with our side? The mercenaries hired by Lübeck and Hamburg are most enthusiastic about robbing, and even volunteer to fight. Since they are willing to pull hatred, Marin did not stop them. However, they are required to carry the flag of their headquarters when robbing. Moreover, priority must be given to robbing wealthy families such as citizens, merchants, nobles, etc. who have status and rich family assets. When Marin sent his men out to rob, they also took off their black cross white vests and removed the East Frisian flag. When they really started, they often played the flags of Lübeck and Hamburg. Obviously, Marin was framing and transferring hatred. Although the four-power alliance and Denmark have completely torn their faces, the two sides are already incompatible. In the future, Denmark will definitely regard any country in the four-power alliance as a mortal enemy. However, even deadly enemies have priorities. In addition, public opinion is also very important. Ancient Europe was different from ancient China. In ancient China, ordinary people had no right to discuss the affairs of the court. If they arbitrarily discussed the affairs of the court, they could easily be beheaded. But in ancient Europe, the citizen class, except the serf class, intervened in the discussion of the court and mocked the king. The citizen class is a very special group. They have the right to elect local members of parliament, have influence on politics, and are very courageous. In 1480, the Grand Duchy of Moscow and Khan Akhmad of the Golden Horde fought a decisive battle. Ivan III quietly fled back to Moscow, but was driven back to the battlefield by local members of parliament and citizens of Moscow with a tough attitude. This kind of thing was simply impossible in ancient China. Therefore, in ancient Europe, the citizen class had a great influence on the government's policy. Marin asked the mercenaries of Lübeck and Hamburg to rob the wealthy citizens under the banner of the two cities, and also asked his men to pretend to be mercenaries of the two cities, which was obviously to help the two cities of Lübeck and Hamburg to attract hatred. Even when he arrived on Zealand Island, Marin directly relaxed the military discipline. Those mercenaries wanted to drag the beautiful Danish girl into the grove, and Marin no longer sent law enforcement teams to manage it. Of course, that was for the mercenaries in Lübeck and Hamburg. For the East Frisian soldiers wearing black cross white vests, Marin still strictly prohibited this. At least, when wearing the conspicuous East Frisian style white bottom black cross vest, such a thing must never be done. In addition, when the mercenaries were doing evil, Marin specially asked them to carry the flags of the two cities. In this way, the Danish people on Zealand Island will hate the two Hanseatic cities of Lübeck and Hamburg. Although the East Frisian county was also hated, its priority was much lower. In the future, even if Denmark rises again, when deciding which city to retaliate against first, the citizens of Zealand will definitely suggest retaliating against Lübeck and Hamburg without hesitation. Because they have been hurt the most by the two cities. The collective will of all citizens and nobles on Zealand, even the king, must carefully consider. Of course, the county of East Frisia will not be happy either. However, at least in the second and third hatreds, the Danes will not take priority in retaliation. In this way, Marin will have enough time to react, mobilize troops, and deal with the Danes. Chapter 100 Night Raid. Kalundborg is only more than 90 kilometers away from Copenhagen. If Marin's army is in a hurry, it will definitely arrive within 2 days. However, because Marin allowed his soldiers to rob on Zealand Island and specially let the mercenaries from Hamburg and Lübeck carry flags to harm the Danish citizens and noble gentry, a lot of time was wasted. It was only more than 90 kilometers away, but the army took 6 days to arrive. At this time, in the coalition forces, in addition to the soldiers themselves and food supplies, there were only carts of looted property left. These mercenaries from Hamburg and Lübeck were also cruel. Not only did they rob people's gold, silver, treasures and food, they also robbed people's cargo carriages to transport stolen goods. Looking at the long dragon-like convoy behind the large army, Marin's mouth twitched. To be honest, seeing these bastards robbed so much property, Marin was a little jealous. A rough estimate shows that the looted property is worth more than 1 million gold coins. Among them, about 7 CDs were robbed by mercenaries from Lübeck and Hamburg. Only 30% belonged to Marin. This was because Marin's army, after occupying each small town, went straight to the official silver vault and granary. In other words, Marin mainly annexed the public property of Denmark, while the mercenaries of Lübeck and Hamburg mainly robbed the civilians, merchants and ordinary noble families of Denmark. As for those nobles and merchants, well, they all seem to live in Copenhagen. Of course, Marin promulgated very strict military discipline, strictly prohibiting the mercenaries of Lübeck and Hamburg from hiding property. Every time he came back from the robbery, Marin would register and pack the property robbed by each mercenary, and uniformly guard it by the baggage corps. Then, after the war, these robbed properties, which belonged to Lübeck and Hamburg, Marin would give half to the mercenaries who were responsible for the robbery and registered according to the principle of equal distribution. The other half was handed over to the officials of Lübeck and Hamburg. Although Lübeck and Hamburg were rich in themselves, the amount of the robbery was too large. Even if it was divided equally with the mercenaries, Lübeck and Hamburg would get a huge fortune of 350,000 gold coins. With this money, the huge investment of the two cities in this war can also be recovered a lot. What's more, Copenhagen, the richest city in Denmark where the Kalmar Union, has not been captured yet. Once Copenhagen is captured, go and rob it. Marin estimates that the value of the property that can be robbed in Copenhagen is definitely higher than it is now. Fortunately, Copenhagen is a port city, and the combined fleet has many ships, which makes it convenient to transport stolen goods. Even better, the two Hanseatic commercial cities of Lübeck and Hamburg have many pawnshops that can be professionally responsible for selling stolen goods, and it is also very convenient to deal with stolen goods. Because the robbery on the way wasted too much time, when the army arrived outside Copenhagen, the Danish sailors on both sides of the narrow Copenhagen Bay were already ready. The Danes seem to have tasted the benefits of tunnels to prevent artillery bombardment. Now, the shores at both ends of Copenhagen Bay are full of tunnels dug by the Danes, crisscrossing. After Marin arrived with the army, he did not know that the Danes had dug pits at first. After all, through the telescope, Marin could not see anything wrong with the Danish position. So he arranged his troops and launched a charge. As a result, in front of the Danish end tunnels, the coalition soldiers who rushed in front were naturally thrown to the ground. If it were not for the timely rescue, the hundreds of soldiers who fell into the pit would probably have died. But even if Marin ordered a rescue, hundreds of people were killed by the Danish sailors in the tunnel. Marin, who calmed down, temporarily stopped the attack on the Danish sailors' position, but ordered the army to withdraw and then set up camp. At night, Marin sent Saul's reconnaissance troops to lurk in front of the Danish sailors' position and approach for reconnaissance. Then, the scouts were surprised to find that those Danish sailors ran out of the tunnels after dark and went back to the camp to rest, and almost no one stayed in the tunnels. When Marin learned of the news, he could no longer sleep. So, in the middle of the night, he called Schwartz, Stade and other East Frisian generals and ordered, blow the emergency assembly whistle and gather the East Frisian veterans. The East Frisian army was strictly trained according to Marin's requirements, so it was common to blow the emergency assembly whistle at night. The soldiers had basically received training in marching or fighting in the middle of the night. Therefore, after the emergency assembly whistle was blown, 13,000 East Frisian veterans in the barracks were dressed neatly in a short time, and gathered outside the tent with their equipment. The mercenaries in Lübeck and Hamburg were in a state of chaos, thinking that the enemy had come to attack at night and almost blew up the camp. As for the 5,000 East Frisian recruits brought by Marin, the training time was relatively short, especially without special night combat training. Therefore, there were only 1,000 East Frisian recruits who finally came to gather. For this, Marin did not blame the recruits. However, in a blink of an eye, Marin immediately sent officers to note the 1,000 recruits who arrived in time, and ordered them to focus on training in the future. These people, without special training, can arrive in time, and look quite smart. In the future, they can be trained as grassroots officers. As for those slow-reacting East Frisian recruits, unless they have made military achievements. Otherwise, the order of promotion must be behind these 1,000 people. Seeing the camp in chaos because of the emergency assembly in the middle of the night, Marin couldn't stand it. Under his order, 4,000 people were separated from the 14,000 troops assembled in East Frisia, took up weapons, and went to deter the panicked Lübeck and Hamburg mercenaries and calm them down. As for the other 10,000 veterans, Marin decided to split his troops into two groups and attack the Danish sailor camps on both sides of the Copenhagen Bay overnight. The encounter during the day made Marin clearly realize that if the Danish sailors hid in the tunnels, if a general attack was launched, it would certainly defeat the enemy, but there would definitely be considerable losses. Because, in front of the densely packed tunnels, the power of the coalition's battle formation could not be exerted at all. Once the formation was in chaos, the fighting power of the guys under Marin was not much better than that of the Danish sailors. Because the East Frisian army relied on strict discipline and dense battle formations to defeat the enemy. If the war was disintegrated by the tunnels, then the battle between the two sides would be no different from a group fight between gangsters. In this way, the casualties of the East Frisian army would definitely be great. It is not impossible to use the mercenaries from Lübeck and Hamburg to fill the pits. However, in this way, the casualties of Lübeck and Hamburg would definitely be great. If this is the last battle, there is nothing wrong with doing so. But the key to the problem is that this is not the last battle. There are still thousands of Danish defenders in Copenhagen. If the losses in the tunnels outside the city are too great, it will be even more difficult to attack the extremely solid Copenhagen. Therefore, Marin was unwilling to waste too much manpower in the process of attacking the Danish tunnels. When Marin heard from the scouts that the enemy had all retreated to the camp on the flat ground to rest in the middle of the night, he immediately ordered an emergency assembly without hesitation, intending to attack the enemy camp at night. In this way, 10,000 East Frisian veterans, led by Marin and Schwartz, split into two groups and prepared to attack the Danish sailor camps at both ends of the Copenhagen Bay. Along the way, none of the East Frisian soldiers lit torches, but relied on the faint starlight, led by more experienced scouts, and quietly moved towards the Danish camp. Because they were marching in the dark, the marching speed was slow. When the army arrived outside the Danish camp, it was already past 4 a.m. It would be dawn in a while. After a slight adjustment, Marin decisively asked his men to light a batch of matchlocks. Then, Donitsrui personally carried a barrel of gunpowder and came to the gate of the Danish sailors' camp on the east side. And, accompanying Donitsrui was another demolition team soldier who was carrying a barrel of butter. When Donitsrui and his companions rushed to the camp gate, the scouts under Saul had already shot and killed the Danish sentry on the gate tower with a crossbow. Although the noise alarmed the Danish soldiers in the camp, what Donitsrui wanted was that no one would disturb them in a short time. So, Donitsrui's teammates first poured a barrel of butter on the wooden fence door of the Danish sailors' camp. Then, Donitsrui put down the gunpowder barrel, lit the fuse, and fled with his companions. Accompanied by a boom explosion. Because there was no time to bury it deep, the gate was not blown up. However, because butter had been poured on the gate beforehand, the fire caught fire quickly. Before the Danish sailors could react, the gate of the camp had been engulfed by the fire. After a while, Marin ordered his spearmen to use their several-meter-long spears to push open the burnt gate. Then, the East Frisian soldiers who followed up, after using the sandbags on their backs to put out the fire in front of the gate caused by butter, rushed in along the collapsed gate, began to prevent fires everywhere, and spread rumors loudly in Danish they had just learned: "The enemy is coming. Our army was defeated. The general is dead. The king is dead." Hearing this, Marin covered his face in shame. "Damn it, the Danish king Hans is still in the city, not in this military camp. How do you know that the king is dead?" Obviously, this slogan that was learned on the spot was rejected due to logic problems before departure, but unexpectedly, someone still shouted it out. But what Marin didn't expect was that the Danish sailors were in a panic at this time. When the soldiers under Marin shouted these rumors in the poor Danish language that they had just learned, many Danish sailors actually believed them. So, the Danish camp became even more chaotic. The Danish sailors looked everywhere for clothes to wear, but the tents were in chaos. In order to save money, except for the general's tents where oil lamps were lit, the tents of ordinary soldiers generally had no lights, so it was naturally dark in the middle of the night. Therefore, at this time, the tents of ordinary Danish soldiers were in chaos. "Hansen, where is my inner treasury?" a Danish sailor asked anxiously. Apparently, this sailor comrade likes to sleep naked. "How should I know? I'm still looking for my left shoe. Damn, where is my left shoe? Did you see it, Ruason?" Just like that, when Marin's army had already attacked the Danish sailors' central army tent, many Danish sailors had not put on their clothes. With the key roads in the camp controlled by the East Frisian army, the Danish sailors were powerless to turn the tide. Some tents that resisted fiercely, the East Frisian veterans did not waste time and directly set the tents on fire with torches. When the stubborn Danish sailors in the tents had to rush out, they were directly skewered by spears and barbecued. Marin's side was very smooth, and Schwartz's side was not bad either. Schwartz did not choose to blow up the door, but he and Kahn, wearing plate armor, each carrying a sledgehammer weighing dozens of kilograms, rushed to the enemy camp, smashed the bolt of the enemy's camp door, and violently opened the enemy camp door. Then, Schwartz's army entered the enemy camp faster than Marin. What's more terrifying is that when the Danish sailor commander ran out of the central army tent and wanted to organize the soldiers to resist, Kahn smashed his head with a hammer. Then, most of the Danish sailors were honest, only some frightened Danish sailors were mentally crazy, holding weapons and slashing at people, like crazy. For such people, the East Frisian army obviously has a way, that is, line up and shoot. When it was dawn, the two Danish sailor camps had all fallen into the control of the East Frisian army. The 10,000 East Frisian veterans brought by Marin suffered only more than 30 casualties. Most of the casualties were caused by the Danish sailors who went crazy because of the bombing of the camp. If there were not many musketeers in the East Frisian army who specialized in dealing with such lunatics, it is estimated that more people would be chopped. What made Marin laugh and cry was that in the sailor camp he occupied, more than 500 of the 4,500 Danish sailors were injured by their own people. Because of the bombing of the camp, many sailors with poor psychological quality in the Danish camp suddenly went crazy. Their eyes were red, and they cut anyone they saw, without distinguishing whether they were enemies or friends. The East Frisian soldiers were better off, at least they had some precautions. The Danish sailors who were scared and fled were more unlucky. They were already in panic, and they didn't expect that their own people would suddenly draw their swords against them. Therefore, there were more people who were infected among the Danish sailors. In this way, through a simple night attack, Marin only used 10,000 veterans and spent more than 3 hours to successfully annihilate 9,000 sailors in the Danish camp, without letting a single enemy escape. And he only paid a small price of more than 30 casualties.